In the 13th century, before the Common Era, along the fertile banks of the Nile Delta, the waters of Egypt's lifeblood turned the color of blood. The reign of Ramesses, the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, master of the two lands, beloved of Amun, had already stretched across 6 decades when an unprecedented ecological catastrophe began to unfold. The most powerful empire on earth, with its towering monuments at Ramesses and Memphis, its granaries overflowing with grain, its armies unmatched from Nubia to the Levant, found itself suddenly vulnerable to forces beyond human control. What ancient scribes recorded as divine punishment, modern science now interprets as a cascading environmental disaster triggered by volcanic activity thousands of miles away. The Hebrew slaves who labored in the brick pits of Goshen, constructing the pharaoh's treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses, had endured generations of bondage since the time of Joseph. Their population had swelled despite systematic oppression, the killing of male infants, the brutal quotas, the whips of Egyptian taskmasters. According to the book of Exodus, a man named Moshe, raised in Pharaoh's own palace but born to Hebrew slaves, had returned from decades of exile in Midian with an impossible demand: "Let my people go." The pharaoh, who considered himself a living god, whose father Seti I had expanded Egypt's dominion to unprecedented heights, would not bow to the god of slaves. The first plague struck with bewildering suddenness. The Nile, which Egyptians worshipped as the god Hapi, source of all fertility and abundance, transformed overnight. Fish died by the millions, their decomposing bodies choking the riverbanks. The stench became unbearable. Water drawn from the sacred river appeared red, thick, and undrinkable. Egyptian priests attempted their own magical rituals, claiming to replicate the phenomenon, but they could not reverse it. The crisis extended beyond mere inconvenience. Egypt's entire civilization depended on the Nile's predictable rhythms. Modern volcanologists and geochemists have proposed a compelling explanation. Drawing on evidence from the Santorini eruption on the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea, this cataclysmic explosion, one of the largest in human history, occurred during the correct historical time frame. The eruption ejected massive quantities of volcanic ash containing iron oxide and other minerals into the atmosphere. These particles, carried by prevailing winds, could have contaminated the Nile's waters, turning them red and toxic. Additionally, the disruption of normal water chemistry may have triggered blooms of toxic algae, specifically Oscillatoria rubescens or burgundy blood algae, which naturally produce a blood-red coloration and release toxins lethal to fish. The ecological interpretation finds support in the sequential nature of the subsequent plagues. With millions of dead fish polluting the waterways, the next catastrophe became inevitable. Frogs, desperate to escape the contaminated water, swarmed onto land in unprecedented numbers. Egyptian homes, temples, and palaces became infested. The amphibians invaded beds, ovens, and kneading bowls. When they died in mass, likely from the same toxins that killed the fish, their rotting corpses attracted the third plague, an explosion of gnats or lice, followed by the fourth plague of flies. Each stage followed logically from the previous environmental collapse. For the Egyptians, who understood their world through the lens of divine order, this sequential devastation carried profound theological implications. Their gods were failing. Hapi could not purify the Nile. Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility, seemed to mock them with an overabundance of her sacred animal. The precise, predictable cosmos they had maintained for millennia through ritual and monument was unraveling. For the Hebrew slaves watching from their segregated settlements, the interpretation was different. Their god, whom they called Yahweh, was systematically dismantling Egypt's pantheon, demonstrating supremacy over the mightiest civilization on earth. The stage was set for an escalating confrontation between Pharaoh's pride and forces beyond any human power to control. As the ecological disaster deepened throughout the Nile Delta, the conflict between Ramesses and the Hebrew prophet intensified into a battle of wills that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. The fifth plague struck Egypt's agricultural foundation. Livestock across the kingdom, the sacred APIs, bulls of Memphis. The herds that represented wealth and sustenance succumbed to a devastating pestilence. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats died in the fields. Egyptian tomb paintings and papyri document the civilization's deep dependence on animal husbandry for transportation, agriculture, milk, and ritual sacrifice. The loss was catastrophic, and according to the biblical account, the livestock of the Hebrews in Goshen remained mysteriously unaffected. Modern epidemiologists suggest that diseases like anthrax or African horse sickness, transmitted by the swarms of insects from the previous plagues, could account for this livestock pandemic. The geographical separation of Hebrew settlements might have provided natural quarantine. Pharaoh's advisors urged compromise, but the king remained intransigent. His hardened response, recorded in Egyptian diplomatic correspondence from this era as characteristic of New Kingdom pharaohs, reflected, it's not merely stubbornness but theological conviction. To capitulate would acknowledge that the gods who legitimized his absolute authority were powerless. The 19th dynasty had risen to prominence through military might and monumental construction. Ramesses could not appear weak before his own people, the vassal kingdoms of Canaan and Syria, or the rival Hittite Empire with whom Egypt maintained an uneasy peace after the Battle of Kadesh decades earlier. The sixth plague manifested as painful boils erupting on humans and surviving animals throughout Egypt. The Hebrew text describes these as festering boils that afflicted even Pharaoh's magicians, who could no longer stand before Moshe. Medical historians propose that the anthrax bacteria responsible for the livestock deaths could produce cutaneous anthrax in humans, causing characteristic black necrotic skin lesions. Alternatively, the unsanitary conditions created by rotting organic matter, dead fish, frogs, and cattle would have fostered numerous bacterial infections. Egyptian physicians, renowned throughout the ancient world for their medical papyri and surgical knowledge, found themselves powerless against the spreading contagion. The seventh plague brought destruction from the heavens. A storm of unprecedented violence swept across Egypt, thunder, lightning, and hail of extraordinary size. According to the biblical narrative recorded in Exodus, the hail struck down everything in the fields, destroying crops, breaking trees, and killing those caught in the open. Fire ran along the ground amid the hail, a phenomenon that matches descriptions of volcanic lightning or ball lightning. The agricultural catastrophe was partially mitigated by timing. The flax and barley were destroyed because they had matured, but the wheat and spelt had not yet grown, promising a delayed harvest. Geological evidence from the Santorini eruption provides a scientific framework for understanding these atmospheric disturbances. Massive volcanic explosions inject millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating spectacular electrical storms. The eruption column generates its own weather system with intense lightning discharges and the formation of hailstones from supercooled water vapor. Pumice stones, which can fall hundreds of miles from the eruption site, might account for the biblical description of hail mixed with fire. According to research published by volcanologists studying the Thera eruption, its effects would have been felt across the entire eastern Mediterranean region. For the first time, Ramesses wavered. He summoned Moshe and admitted sin, pleading for the storm to end. When it did, his resolve immediately hardened again, a psychological pattern consistent with post-traumatic responses to overwhelming disasters. The pharaoh's court had become bitterly divided. Senior officials openly questioned their king's refusal to release the Hebrew slaves, asking how long these people would remain a snare to Egypt. The empire's economic infrastructure was collapsing, yet the king, who had spent his reign proclaiming his own divinity, could not reverse course. The next plague would push Egypt into deeper darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The eighth plague descended upon Egypt with the sound of countless wings darkening the sky in a living, devouring cloud. Locusts, grasshoppers transformed by crowding stress into their gregarious, migratory phaser, arrived in swarms of biblical proportion. The phenomenon, known scientifically as Schistocerca gregaria, or desert locusts, remains one of nature's most devastating agricultural catastrophes, even in the modern era. A single swarm can contain billions of insects, covering hundreds of square miles, consuming every green plant in its path. For ancient Egypt, dependent on the Nile's annual flood to produce grain surplus that fed the empire and maintained its tributary states, the arrival of locusts represented existential threat. The biblical account describes the locusts as covering the ground until it was black, filling the houses of Egyptians, consuming everything the hail had left, every tree, every plant, until nothing green remained in all of Egypt. Modern entomologists recognize this description as consistent with major locust plagues. which occur when environmental conditions create perfect breeding grounds. The unusual weather patterns caused by volcanic activity changes in wind direction, humidity, and temperature can trigger the hormonal changes that transform solitary grasshoppers into swarming locusts. The ecological disruption from previous plagues had already stressed Egypt's agricultural system. The locusts delivered the final devastation. Pharaoh's officials confronted their king directly according to the Exodus narrative. "How long shall this man be a snare to us?" they demanded. "Let the men go, that they may serve their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" This unprecedented challenge to royal authority reflected the complete breakdown of confidence in Pharaoh's divine judgment. The treasury was depleted, the fields were destroyed, the livestock were dead, and the population suffered from disease. Yet Ramesses continued negotiating in bad faith, offering partial compromises. The men could go but not the women and children, or the people but not their flocks. Knowing such terms were unacceptable. After the locusts came, perhaps the most psychologically devastating plague, darkness that could be felt. For 3 days, according to the biblical text, thick darkness covered Egypt, darkness so profound that people could not see one another, could not move from their places. Yet in the Hebrew settlements of Goshen, there was light. Historians and climatologists, drawing from research on major volcanic events documented by Cambridge archaeologist John Baines and others studying this period, suggest that the Santorini eruption produced an ash cloud that could have created this darkness. Volcanic ash in the atmosphere blocks sunlight, and when dense enough, can create a darkness so complete that it disorients and terrifies those experiencing it. For the Egyptians, who worshipped Ra, the sun god, as supreme among deities, whose entire cosmology centered on the sun's daily journey through the sky, this darkness represented the ultimate theological catastrophe. The sun god had abandoned Egypt. The pharaoh, who claimed to be Ra's son in earthly manifestation, could not restore light. In temples throughout the kingdom, priests performed desperate rituals to no avail. The darkness was particularly devastating for a civilization that understood chaos, represented by the god Set and the serpent Apophis's darkness threatening to overwhelm cosmic order. Their worst theological nightmare had materialized. When light finally returned, Ramesses summoned Moshe once more. The pharaoh was willing to let the Hebrews go, including their families, but demanded their flocks and herds remain as collateral. Moshe refused. The confrontation ended with Pharaoh's final, furious declaration, "Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die." The prophet's response carried ominous weight, as you say, "I will not see your face again." Neither man knew that the next plague, the 10th and final catastrophe, would transform the theological, political contest into a human tragedy so profound that it would echo through 3 millennia of human memory. At midnight on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, in the 13th century before the Common Era, death swept through Egypt in a single, terrible night. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, stands as the darkest moment in the Exodus narrative. According to the biblical account, every firstborn in Egypt died that night. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. The Hebrew slaves, following Moshe's instructions, had marked their doorposts with lamb's blood and sheltered inside their homes while the destroying angel passed through Egypt. The Egyptians, waking to discover their children dead, raised a great cry of anguish, a cry unlike anything Egypt had known. Modern scholars have proposed various naturalistic explanations for this catastrophic mortality event. One hypothesis suggests that the firstborn, who received preferential treatment in ancient cultures, had first access to grain stores. If these stores had been contaminated by mycotoxins, poisonous compounds produced by fungi that thrive in damp conditions, the firstborn consuming new grain would have been disproportionately affected. The previous plagues had created ideal conditions for fungal growth, flooding, humidity, and organic decay. Mycotoxin poisoning causes respiratory failure and death, potentially explaining the sudden mass mortality. Another scientific theory, proposed by epidemiologists studying ancient disease patterns, suggests that the ecological disasters had created conditions for an epidemic of bubonic plague or a similar virulent pathogen. The sequential plagues, especially the massive die-offs of rodents and the swarms of fleas, matched the pattern preceding major plague outbreaks. In a culture where the firstborn held special status and participated in specific ritual or social practices, differential exposure to infection vectors could account for the selective mortality pattern. Ramesses II himself lost his firstborn son in this catastrophe. Egyptian records become fragmentary regarding this period, but the pharaoh's monumental construction projects and military campaigns had always been dedicated to ensuring his dynasty's continuation. The death of his heir, presumably Amenhotep, named in temple inscriptions, represented not just personal tragedy, but political disaster. The succession question that had been settled now became uncertain, weakening Egypt's stability at home and abroad. That night, as described in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh summoned Moshe and Aaron in darkness and spoke words of absolute surrender. "Rise up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord, as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The proud king who had defied the Hebrew God, who had hardened his heart through 9 previous plagues, finally broke under the weight of collective national grief. The Egyptian people, desperate to end the catastrophes, urged the Hebrews to leave quickly, giving them articles of silver, gold, and clothing both as payment for generations of forced labor and as desperate bribes to hasten their departure. The Exodus itself began in chaos. According to biblical accounts preserved in the Torah, approximately 600,000 men left Egypt on foot, plus women and children and a mixed multitude of other slaves and servants, possibly 2 million people total. Though modern scholars debate these numbers extensively, they left so hastily that their bread dough had no time to rise, leading to the tradition of unleavened bread that Jews commemorate annually during Passover. The column of refugees, carrying their children, their few possessions, and the coffin of Joseph, whose bones they had vowed to return to Canaan, began the journey toward the Red Sea. Behind them, Egypt lay devastated, its economy shattered, its theological certainties destroyed, its homes filled with mourning. Ahead lay a journey through wilderness that would forge a collection of traumatized slaves into a nation with a covenant and a destiny. 7. Days after the Hebrews departed from Egypt, Pharaoh's grief transformed into rage and regret. The Exodus had created immediate political and economic crisis. The brick pits stood empty, construction projects halted, and agricultural work that depended on forced labor ground to a standstill. Ramesses, conferring with his surviving advisors and military commanders, recognized that allowing such a massive slave population to escape would invite rebellion throughout his empire. His prestige, already damaged by the plagues, could not sustain this additional humiliation. The king ordered his army mobilized, 600 selected chariots plus all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them, would pursue the fleeing slaves and return them to bondage. The Egyptian chariot corps represented the ancient world's most sophisticated military technology. 2-wheeled vehicles drawn by trained horses, manned by a driver and archer, capable of rapid deployment and devastating charges, these chariots had secured Egypt's empire through generations of warfare. Against a disorganized column of refugees on foot, the military calculus seemed straightforward. The army overtook the Hebrews at Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, where the refugees found themselves trapped with water before them and Egypt's war machine behind them. What happened next at the Red Sea? Whether the Yam Suf was the Red Sea proper, the Gulf of Suez, or one of the marshy lakes in the Nile Delta remains among the most debated events in biblical scholarship. The Exodus account describes the waters dividing, allowing the Hebrews to cross on dry ground, then returning to engulf the pursuing Egyptian army. When Moshe stretched out his hand, every chariot, every horse, every soldier who had entered the sea perished. Pharaoh's army was destroyed completely. Scientific explanations for the sea crossing have included winds set down, a meteorological phenomenon where strong, sustained winds can temporarily push water aside in shallow areas, creating temporary land bridges. Computer modeling by researchers studying ancient topography and weather patterns has demonstrated that east winds of approximately 60 miles per hour, sustained for 12 hours, could have pushed back waters in the Reed Marshland Lakes region, allowing passage before the winds ceased and waters returned. This natural explanation aligns with the biblical text's mention of a strong east wind all night. Alternatively, some scholars propose that seismic activity associated with the distant volcanic eruption could have caused a tsunami withdrawal and return pattern, though this hypothesis remains more speculative. For Egypt, the military disaster at the Red Sea represented the culminating catastrophe of a sequence that had begun with the Nile turning red. The loss of Pharaoh's elite chariot force, combined with the previous economic devastation, effectively ended Ramesses II's military campaigns for years. Egyptian historical records from this period become notably sparse, a phenomenon historians interpret as deliberate erasure of embarrassing defeats, a common practice when historical events contradicted the pharaoh's divine infallibility. The refugees, now permanently liberated by Egypt's inability to pursue them further, continued into the Sinai wilderness, where their transformation from slaves into a covenanted nation would begin at Mount Sinai. Behind them, Egypt slowly recovered its stability, though it never again achieved the dominance of the early 19th dynasty. Ramesses would reign for decades more, eventually becoming Ramesses the Great in modern memory for his architectural achievements. But the Exodus marked a turning point in Egyptian power. The historical evidence for these events remains fragmentary and contested. No Egyptian source explicitly describes the Exodus or the plagues, though references to Haparu people and periods of instability appear in various documents. The Merneptah Stele from approximately 1207 before the Common Era mentions Israel as an established people in Canaan, providing the earliest non-biblical reference to the Israelites. The absence of direct Egyptian confirmation might reflect the systematic erasure of shameful defeats from official records, a documented practice of New Kingdom pharaohs. The convergence of biblical narrative with volcanic, ecological, and epidemiological evidence suggests that behind the theological interpretation lies a genuine catastrophic sequence. The question of whether natural phenomena can explain the biblical plagues leads not to simple answers, but to profound reflections on how humans interpret catastrophic events. The scientific hypothesis connecting the plagues to the Santorini eruption rests on substantial geological evidence. Core samples from the eastern Mediterranean seabed contain layers of Theron ash dated to the correct historical period, the Late Bronze Age, coinciding with Egypt's 19th dynasty. The eruption's magnitude estimated at a volcanic explosivity index of 7, comparable to Krakatoa in 1883, would have produced atmospheric effects across thousands of miles. Pumice from Santorini has been found in Egyptian archaeological contexts, confirming that volcanic material reached the Nile region. The cascade of consequences from such an eruption aligns remarkably with the plague sequence. Volcanic ash acidifies water and introduces iron compounds that promote toxic algae blooms, explaining the red, deadly water. Dead fish force amphibians onto land, creating conditions for insect population explosions. Livestock consuming contaminated water or vegetation succumb to disease. Humans develop skin infections from unsanitary conditions. Atmospheric disturbances produce violent weather phenomena. Darkness results from dense ash clouds. Contaminated grain stores spread mycotoxins. Each stage flows logically from the previous disruption. Yet this naturalistic explanation raises deeper questions rather than resolving the fundamental mystery. If the plagues resulted from natural processes, does this diminish or enhance their meaning? The biblical text never claims the events violated natural law. Rather, it emphasizes their timing, their sequence, their selective impact, and their correspondence to prophetic warnings. The Exodus narrative presents these as signs events, whose natural mechanisms serve a larger, purposeful pattern, demonstrating divine authority over both nature and empire. The question of historicity remains contested among scholars. Maximalist interpreters accept the biblical account as substantially historical, pointing to Egyptian evidence of Semitic populations, brick-making slaves, and periods of instability. Minimalist scholars argue the narrative was composed much later as theological literature, not historical record, and that archaeological evidence for large-scale Israelite presence in Egypt remains absent. Middle positions suggest a smaller historical exodus was later elaborated into the foundational national narrative of the Jewish people. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, in his research on ancient Near Eastern civilizations, has argued that the Exodus narrative contains too many authentic Egyptian details, names, titles, cultural practices, and geographical references to be purely fictional composition from later periods. The description of brick-making procedures, the store cities, the Egyptian administrative structure, and even the pharaoh's characterization match New Kingdom realities.
Nice.
Counterarguments note that later scribes could have incorporated accurate historical details into theological narrative, without the core events being historical. The enduring power of the Exodus story transcends these academic debates. For 3 millennia, the narrative has shaped Jewish identity and religious practice through annual Passover commemoration. The theme of liberation from slavery influenced Christian theology and iconography. In modern history, the Exodus became a powerful metaphor for oppressed peoples seeking freedom. From African American spirituals during slavery through civil rights movements to contemporary liberation theology, stories archetypal power slaves overcoming the world's greatest empire through divine intervention continues resonating regardless of historical certainty. The intersection of science and scripture in examining the plagues ultimately reveals how humans construct meaning from catastrophe. Ancient Egyptians interpreted the events as cosmic disorder threatening Maat. Hebrew slaves saw divine punishment of their oppressors and miraculous deliverance. Modern scientists discern natural catastrophe with tragic human consequences. These interpretations need not be mutually exclusive. A volcanic eruption that devastated Egypt while enabling Hebrew escape could be simultaneously natural process and meaningful providence, depending on one's framework for understanding reality. The plagues remain what they have always been, a sequence of catastrophic events that destroyed an empire's confidence, liberated and enslaved people, and generated a narrative powerful enough to shape 3 major world religions. Whether explained by volcanic eruption, divine intervention, or some synthesis of natural process and transcendent purpose, the Exodus endures as humanity's archetypal story of suffering leading to liberation, of empire confronting limitations, of remembered trauma becoming redemptive meaning across generations.